On this episode of Live Open Daily, the old Oculus Rift store, or Link PC as Meta wants to call it now, is chock full of exclusive games that have never been on any other platform. We're going over the 10 I most like to see ported to Quest. I'm your host Live Open Mike. If you're watching the video version of this podcast, it will just be screenshots and some video footage because I'm currently fighting a migraine, so turning on my lights and camera is a bad idea at the moment. In previous episodes, we talked about PlayStation VR 1 exclusive titles like Astrobot Rescue Mission, Blood and Truth, Rush of Blood, and Farpoint, and why those games aren't coming to the PlayStation VR 2, so it only feels right to do the same for Quest. Now, I also did a podcast about Project Avalanche, Meta's PC VR cloud gaming service that's still in development, but we have no idea when that's coming, so until then, players on Quest, Pico, Steam, and PlayStation VR are really missing out. Now, there will be some spoilers for all of these games, so if you want to remain unspoiled, feel free to skip ahead if you hear a game that you don't want to know anything about. First up are what I like to call the Insomniac Games trio, that's Stormland, Edge of Nowhere, and Feral Rights. Stormland is regarded as one of the best PC VR games ever made. This is a story-based shooter set in a dystopian future where humanity has disappeared. You play as a robot named Vesper who wakes up after your base was attacked by an antagonistic group called the Tempest. You start the game injured with missing memories and have to rescue your friends, upgrade your body, and go to war against the Tempest. This game is absolutely gorgeous to look at, and the gameplay is fantastic and unique in a lot of places. You cloud surf from island to island, you break down weapons that run out of ammo for materials to craft new ones, your hands are magnetic allowing you to climb any surface. It's just great. Without spoiling too much in the story, there's an odd twist about halfway through where suddenly it becomes like a race against time and you only have until Tuesday morning in real time to complete the final portion. Edge of Nowhere is a third-party action adventure with a story straight out of H.P. Lovecraft. This game is so old in VR years 2016 that it predated the original Oculus Touch controllers, so you have to play it with an Xbox controller. You play as Victor, a man looking for his fiancée who was lost in an expedition to the Antarctic. Along the way, you relive memories of your past and face an onslaught of these really creepy alien-like creatures. There's also platforming, like some really well done ice climbing, some decent gameplay, and a mind-bending story I refuse to say anything else about because you just kinda need to experience it for yourself. Games like this are proof that VR games played sitting down with a controller can still be highly entertaining and really well made. Then there's Feral Rights. I'm completely gonna date myself here, but if you remember an old side-scrolling beat-em-up from Sega called Alter Beast, that's the vibe of this one. This is another 2016 gamepad game with a fixed camera at that, so think like the first Resident Evil game. I love playing games like this back in the day. The story is pretty simple. You're on a mission to avenge your father, and to do so you have to fight your way through a bunch of jungles and temples. You eventually learn to transform yourself into a beast like the werewolf that's on the title screen of this game, and that lets you do a lot of really big damage. It's just a really fun 3D beat 'em up, and you don't really see a whole lot of games like this anymore, even on flat screen, so I'd love to see it come to Quest. Insomniac also made another game called The Unspoken, but I can't speak to that one since I've never played it. As for why we won't see these games on other platforms, well, Insomniac Games was acquired by Sony in 2019, and it spent the last few years making the very popular Spider-Man games for PlayStation and PC. Those games have been absolute cash cows for Sony, including 2023's hit Spider-Man 2, which has sold over 11 million copies. To add to that, all of the Rift games I just listed were actually funded by Meta, or Oculus as they were known at the time. So while some fans have expected these to be remade for PSVR 2, there's no shot Sony is going to pull resources from the makers of one of their most successful franchises to make VR games again. Moreover, with Sony's recent layoffs, including the closure of London studios, all indications are Insomniac will never make a VR game again, and that's really a shame because they made a lot of quality stuff. Next up are two games for Twisted Pixel, a studio actually owned by Meta. The first is Defector, an absolute wild ride of a spy thriller. The story is bonkers, there's no other way to describe it, but the gameplay is so good that it really doesn't matter. This game is broken up into 5 missions where you and your team are traveling the world looking for the pieces of a mysterious device. All of the chapters actually have branches where you can choose to take one path or the other. Every time you face this choice, you enter some kind of action thriller set piece. You get injected by true serum and interrogated, you jump out of a plane, you drive out of a plane, you have a chase sequence through a downtown area, and that's just the first 2 levels. I love this game. The story is crazier the further you get into it. There's multiple endings. However, it's not a game of the year. It's relatively short and you can do all the paths and every ending inside 4 hours. But like I said, I love this game. The second game is Wilson's Heart. This is the kind of weird experimenting that used to happen more often years ago when developers were just experimenting with VR. This is a noir psychological thriller styled like an old black and white monster movie, complete with way over the top characters just chewing the scenery and super campy voice acting. It's pretty heavy on story with a lot of isolated puzzles, so if you're an action junkie, this one's a pass. If you appreciate some humor, and at times dark humor and a decent mystery, you'll enjoy this. As for Twisted Pixel as a studio, they're owned by Meta, and as previously reported on another podcast, they had a job listing posted for about a year for a lead VR producer, specifically looking for one experienced in AAA game development. The rumors are they're working on an entirely new franchise, and the reality is none of these games were moneymakers, which is part of what drove Meta into standalone in the first place, because they financed a lot of games that didn't make money. Sticking with Meta for a little while longer, let's talk about Asgard's Wrath 1. Until Asgard's Wrath 2 released on Quest, this was my favorite VR game. This is an action RPG based in Norse mythology. It's considered to be one of the best PC VR, really one of the best VR games ever made. You have the power to possess mortals, and the story breaks down into you helping 4 different characters. A complete badass Viking named Ingrid, she was my favorite character in the whole game, a dark sorcerer named Frodi, an elven thief named Sakan, and Risi, who's a half giant. All these characters have a vendetta against the gods for different personal reasons. On top of that, you use your powers to turn certain animals into humanoid companions to fight at your side, and they all have special abilities to open up new areas of the game. Combine all that with the overarching Norse god storyline, and this makes for an epic adventure you'll easily get like 60 plus hours out of if you do everything in the game. Now personally, I think the second game improves on this one in every possible way except the graphics, because that one's on standalone, but the first Asgard's Wrath is still terrific. Anyone who bought the Quest 3 before June 30th got both games for free, so you have a PC and a lot of hard drive space. This game is over 100 gigs, this should be a must play for you. As for why it's not on Quest, frankly I don't have a good answer for this. Now, I fully expected a standalone sequel to this game. I talked about that on the YouTube video last year. Sanzaru, and by extension Meta, had the name World of Wrath trademarked for years, but the fact that they gave away this game for free on PC with Quest 3 and instead just dropped the sequel in December, I really can't see this game coming to Quest anytime soon, though if I had to bet on any of these games on this list being ported, this would be my bet. Unlike these next 2 games, Lone Echo 1 and 2. I'm going to lump these 2 together because they're basically one continuous story. You play as an android named Jack on the space station. Your main interaction is with one of the best NPCs ever in a VR game, at least in my opinion, that's Captain Olivia Rhodes. You're on a mission to repair your busted station and of course run into all kinds of obstacles. There's a mysterious biomass that constantly annoyingly attacks you if you get too close to it. There's time travel involved, life and death stakes. Oh, and by the way, you are on the space station, so the whole game takes place in zero gravity. If you're new to VR, don't touch this game, it will make you sick. The second game was the final PC VR game funded by Meta, and it didn't release in the greatest state. It had some pretty bad optimization issues and bugs that, to my knowledge, were never fixed. Having said all that, if the game's reported as a standalone, presumably Ready at Dawn would go through and fix all of those. That's not likely to happen though, because Ready at Dawn, well, you ever heard of a little game called Echo VR? Had a really active community, one of the only VR games to ever make VR esports look truly viable, was originally just an add-on to the Lone Echo series and grew to be the most popular game in the franchise. Yeah, well, Meta shut that game down so they could, quote, free up resources for the next project. That was last year. We haven't heard anything about said project since Echo VR shut down. At least when Third shut down Swords of Gargantua, a decision they would later reverse, they announced Altair Breaker soon after that. Couple that with the fact that Ready at Dawn was part of a series of layoffs at Meta last year, and that team was severely reduced, and I'm fairly confident that team doesn't have the bandwidth to port 2 decent-sized PC VR games to Quest and work on this mysterious third project. Maybe the new projects Lone Echo 3 and like Asgard's Wrath 2 they'll offer the first 2 games with Meta's next headset after the Quest 3S. I don't know. The next game is From Other Suns. We clearly have a lack of co-op games, roguelites, and shooters in VR, especially on Quest, so this would absolutely fill that gap. I'm joking, of course. We have plenty of those already. However, all of those genres are plentiful and popular for a reason. VR lends itself to games with quick gameplay loops that are easy to pop in and out of. Roguelites are great for that, even if they're not exactly my cup of tea. Co-op and FPS games also tend to do quite well in VR, assuming they're well made, so mash all 3 of those together, set it in space, and give it a sense of humor, and you have From Other Suns. Aside from an issue with newer CPUs that there is a known fix for, this game is very well reviewed, but at a price tag of $40 and being a Rift exclusive, it's basically a dead game. I never hear about this one in any of the subreddits, discords, or other groups that I'm in. And it's a real shame because this game has about as much of a chance of being ported to Quest as the Insomniac games I talked about earlier. Why? Okay, strap in for a history lesson. Other Suns was made by a developer named Gunfire Games. They are best known for the second 2 games in the Darksiders franchise. Gunfire Games was founded from the core team of Crytek USA, a studio that itself was created after Vigil Games, the creators of the original Darksiders game, was acquired by THQ and then shut down when THQ filed bankruptcy in 2013. Crytek USA hit a financial crisis that prevented them from paying their employees on time, So most of the studio leadership and the employees ended up leaving the company, including David Adams, who founded Gunfire Games in 2014. Still with me? Great. Now jump ahead to 2019 when Gunfire Games got acquired by THQ Nordic. Wait, yeah, you thought THQ was bankrupt, not a business? You're right. The original name of the studio was Nordic Games, and they were renamed THQ Nordic after their parent company, Embracer Group, acquired the THQ trademark after their bankruptcy. If you don't know about Embracer Group, they are, let's say, very investor-driven, and they've been notorious for layoffs and generally anti-consumer, profit-driven business decisions that trickles down to all the companies that they own. Gunfire's last VR game was Cronus Before the Ashes in 2020. This one is another third-person fantasy adventure with a fixed camera, and it was released as a prequel to their flat-screen game Remnant Before the Ashes. Cronus Before the Ashes was itself a remake of their original Cronus VR game from 2016, and Before the Ashes was also a hybrid game that saw flat-screen versions on Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and Stadia. The point to all of this is From Other Suns was their final VR-only title, and now it's 7 years old. They've never made a standalone VR game, and since their most recent game, Remnant 2, was fairly successful by their measures, I doubt Gunfire returns to VR. Our final game is Witchblood, a third-person side-scrolling Metroidvania from Hidden Path Entertainment. Unlike my joke about From Other Suns, Metroidvanias are absolutely in short supply in VR, and I kinda understand why. Metroidvanias are a bit of an acquired taste in general, and most story-based games in VR are fairly linear. So building in a mechanic where the player is forced to backtrack to previously explored areas could come off tedious in VR unless you have a good fast travel system. Most players aren't going to want to manually walk, climb, ride, whatever back and forth over and over. Now, it's not to say the Metroidvania games haven't been tried in VR. There's a second Jupitergrad game and Genotype, just to name a couple. I reviewed both of those on my YouTube channel and really enjoyed them, so check out those videos if you want to know more about them. There are actually several third-person games on Quest like the Moss series, Lucky's Tale, VR Adventure, Ghost Giant, and most recently Max Mustard. However, all those are 3D games, much like Edge of Nowhere and Feral Rights from earlier in this podcast. Witchblood is a 2D side-scroller with no true motion controls or 6-off movement. The only game close to this on Quest is Down the Rabbit Hole, and that game does have a sequel coming later this year, so it's not entirely unprecedented, but it's still a pretty big long shot. Hidden Path Entertainment started in VR with a port of their tower defense game, Defense Grid 2 in 2016. They followed that up with Witchblood in 2017, then a real-time strategy game called Brass Tactics in 2018, and the more recent game, Raccoon Lagoon, was released on Rift and Quest in 2019. They haven't released a game since, though their website does state that they are working on a Dungeons & Dragons RPG with no indication of that project being built for VR. Raccoon Lagoon, their last game, just has 199 ratings on the Metastore and 32 reviews. Yikes. The general rule of thumb, barring a 90% discount code to boost your sales, is 30 units sold for every one review, so doing the math, that's less than 1,000 copies sold. Having said all that, I like Witchblood, and there's nothing really like it on standalone, and I'd love to see games and genres unique to VR gain a wider audience. That's a wrap for this episode. I don't do game list content like this often, so let me know how you feel about it. Catch a Live Open Daily podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, iHeart, and catch me streaming VR on Twitch, twitch.tv/liveopenmic. Catch you on the next one.